Hi, and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we'll be talking about upcoming content for History Respawned, as well as recent news related to upcoming historical games. News that would have come out at E3, but instead came out in drips and drabs over the course of June. And finally, we'll wrap things up today by discussing the games, historical or otherwise, that we've been playing recently. And joining me on today's show to help me walk through all this material is John Harney. Hey, John, how are you doing?
I'm good, Bob. How are you?
I'm okay. We're still going through kind of social distancing and isolation here in Texas. I hope things are going well for you in Kentucky.
Yeah, they're going pretty well, I think. The numbers are okay here, but we're still being pretty conservative, honestly. I guess it's what we're all doing.
Yep.
Until we know otherwise.
Yep. So first thing today is I was going to talk a little bit about what's going on with History Respawned. As you probably noticed, the show has a new look and a new avatar in the form of Pixel Lincoln. And I've been talking to John for a long time about changing the look of the show, and we finally found the time in early June to work with some graphic artists to get a new look. So we hope you like it. And we're really excited about it. I'm excited about it. I don't know what John thinks.
I love it. I love Pixel Lincoln. I love the fact that his name is also Pixel Lincoln. It's awesome.
So the second thing we've got going on with History Respawn is we're developing kind of a new show within the banner of History Respawn, and we're calling this new show Civs 101. And the idea behind this show is that we're going to have historians discussing the leaders and civs from Sid Meier's Civilization 6. And in particular, they're going to spend time considering the civs and how they're represented by the series, and also investigate the idea of civilization, big C civilization in kind of a larger sense. And I think John and I are going to do a couple of the early episodes for this, but then we're going to turn it over to other scholars so they get a chance to talk about this. And the idea that we had was to do kind of a shorter series of videos. So in other words, instead of like a 45 minute video show or podcast, instead we'll have something that's about 15 minutes. So a bit easier to digest. And I think that time is more than enough time to deal with kind of larger issues and micro issues related to the ways in which particular civs are dealt with by Sid Meier's game.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think History Respawned in kind of bits and bobs has always kind of turned to civilization, which makes sense, and a lot of people ask us about civilization, and I think this kind of deep dive makes sense for us, and it'll be a good start. I'd enjoy, Bob, you and me chatting about it, but we've got a lot of cool people that are hopefully going to come in, and we're going to hear from them, and it'll be great. We hope to tap into that exhaustive interest in civilization and civilization adjacent games. Mm-hmm. A little foreshadowing for later in the podcast there.
Ooh, nice. Okay. And the last thing is we've got a set of regular History Respawn episodes coming up in the next couple of months. I am going to be working on the Assassin's Creed 3 episode, the patron voted Assassin's Creed 3 episode. And then John, for his part, he's got episodes coming up on Old World, the new 4X game. And then also, I think, John, you were looking at Ghosts of Tsushima as a possibility, right?
I'm planning to do Ghosts of Tsushima. I'm really interested to see how much they get into the kind of Mongolian invasion era Japan stuff, which would be, samurai stuff feels saturated, but there's so much stuff we actually very rarely, at least in the West, we very rarely kind of get exposed to. That game is also beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I'll be doing Ghost of Tsushima for sure. And then Old World I'm looking forward to, and I think we might do... It just came out in early access quite recently. And so I think we'll kind of do our own little early access look, and maybe we'll revisit it again when it comes out. And Old World is from the developers of Off-World Trading Company, mm-hmm. which is a really interesting sci-fi strategy game where you're actually effectively... It's kind of an RTS, except it's pure capitalism. Or pre-military capitalism, what I want to call it. And so they apparently, at least this is what other people are saying with Old World, is it's an interesting hybrid of kind of a Civilization 4X type game and Crusader Kings 2 style character development. So I thought, well, it sounds like they made it just for me. So I'm looking forward to having a look at that soon.
Yeah, the developer of that game, Mohawk Games, is led by Soren Johnson, and Soren was, I believe, one of the lead developers on Civilization 3, and certainly the lead developer on Civilization 4. So he's got an impressive pedigree when it comes to 4X games. And he also has this wonderful podcast called Designer Notes, which is on the Idle Thumbs network. And on that show, he interviews famous game developers, games writers, producers about their work and about their careers. And so if you're interested in 4X games, I highly recommend listening to Designer Notes, Soren Johnson's show. He's got a great series of episodes where he interviews Brian Reynolds, who developed Sid Meier's Civilization 2 and the original version of Alpha Centauri. He's also got a 4-part episode where he interviews Sid Meier. He interviews Bruce Shelley, who developed Age of Empires and worked with Sid Meier on Civilization. Just a really, really, really good show if you're interested in that kind of stuff. All right, well, I think that does it for the logistical stuff with History Respawn. I hope all of that stuff sounds interesting to all of our listeners, and particularly to our patrons. Again, thank you so much for your support. Without patrons, we wouldn't have this podcast, and we wouldn't have Pixel Lincoln in our life either. So thank you very much. Okay, well, let's turn to talking about history news that came out of what we might call the non-E3 that we just had. And there really wasn't too much history game related news that came out of this past month. A lot of the bigger history related news or history game related news had come out in months previous in the spring. We had the announcement of AC Valhalla. We had more news about Empire of Sin. And then we'd gotten a lot of information already about Humankind, Amplitude's kind of challenger to Civilization. But there were kind of a few bits of more detail about some games that we had already had announced. In particular, we learned more about Creative Assembly's new Total War game, Total War Troy, which is going to be looking at the kind of historical and mythological versions of the Trojan War, which was made famous, of course, by Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. And this is a game, at least in pre-release coverage, has really shown a lot of what you might call kind of it's an interesting mixture. They're going for a mixture of real historical detail about this time period and about this conflict, but then also adding in kind of mythological elements. And I think this is kind of an interesting direction for Creative Assembly, for the Total War team, because they've been doing this over the past, 5 years or so, where they have a kind of a straight historical title, and then they follow that up with kind of a science fiction or mythologically inspired Total War game. And so in this game, it kind of seems like they're trying to combine those two elements.
Yeah, and Total War Three Kingdoms was totally a step along that path as well, because in addition to, and I guess Troy is a similar thing, the same thing with the history of the Peloponnesian War and the history of the Three Kingdoms. The actual source material you have is, was written for specific reasons and specific cultural arenas and everything else. So they embrace that in Three Kingdoms to kind of embrace the ambiguity in a way that really worked. And then, so I think they're taking it to the next step with Troy. And then in Three Kingdoms, you actually could pick your mode of which you wanted to play. Like, do you want to play a version of this game that is more about the characters, both in the actual battles, but also in the strategy? Or do you want to just play, like, quote unquote, a typical Total War game in this setting? And I missed whether or not Troy offers that option, but I suspect it would. Maybe not, because the mythology thing comes in so much, but I think it's fascinating. Because the Total War Three Kingdoms is a really good game. And the Warhammer games are really good. They're kind of bananas, and they let themselves off the leash a bit, maybe in a way they didn't want to do with like Total War Attila. So is Troy the masterpiece? Is Troy another step on the road to the next part? I don't know. It's fascinating.
Yeah. So Total War Troy is going to be coming out on August 13th, and it is going to be exclusive to the Epic Store, another kind of notch in the Epic Store's battle against Steam. And also, Total War Troy will be free for the first 24 hours of its release on Epic Store. So if that sounds interesting to you, even if it doesn't sound that interesting to you and you just want a free game, go to the Epic Store on August 13th, and I'm sure the Epic Store servers will not crash at all, and you'll be able to download that game in no time at all. So in addition to news about Total War, we also had some more gameplay trailers, extensive playthrough news, preview news regarding Crusader Kings 3. And most of that coverage, I don't know if you saw anything different, John, but most of that coverage kind of focused on the new user interface elements, kind of trying to make the game more legible to people who have maybe not been as well versed in Paradox games before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's something, this has been a goal of theirs from the start, and I've said this before on the podcast, but if anybody plays Imperator Rome, or if you were interested in the Paradox games, but just felt I just can't even get into this, Imperator Rome is not a bad place to start because they improved things, but it is a weird thing. Like, I learned Crusader Kings 2 by going to a forum post. This guy had like 5 web pages worth of how Ireland conquered like the early modern, the medieval period, medieval Europe, and it sucks because if you can get to the point where you're really kind of enjoying the game in that way, it's one of the best gaming experiences you can have, but getting people there is really hard. So I'm glad they understand that. I hope they succeed with CK3, because CK3, it will definitely be the most accessible game they've made. Mm-hmm. How accessible it will be, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they've done some weird, like, I think they released Stellaris on console, didn't they? They did all kinds of interesting things with those games.
I mean, I would hope it works too. And I think they can manage it without kind of impinging too much on their successful gameplay formula. What makes the Paradox games work so well. But I would also love to have better UI so that it reaches more players, and and perhaps it becomes a game that we could even use in a classroom setting, because I think right now it's too difficult. You couldn't do something like that.
That's such a great point. I think you might have had this exact same experience, but like I would kind of crowdsource suggestions from gaming people of all kind of different types, what to do in the classroom, and so many people will say to me, "Oh, you got to do, Burning Versailles 4, Crusader Kings." I'm like, I can't.
No, you can't.
I can't onboard between 20 and 30 people.
Yeah.
It's just not doable.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be awesome. It's also interesting, there's been a debate the last few days in the United States about in some sections like dad history versus other types of history and stuff, i.e. what does accessible history look like? And the Paradox games they're just a very different way of engaging with history than Assassin's Creed Odyssey, for example. They're not better necessarily, it's different. And so I think they've got a space already, but I'd love to see it get bigger. That history nerd in me, I know there's more people like us, they just haven't been awoken yet.
That's right. Yeah, they haven't been activated. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And we also learned this month that Humankind, which is Amplitude's challenger to the Civilization series, is now being pushed back into 2021, largely because of the outbreak, the pandemic of COVID-19. But despite the pushback, however, the developers have announced that they're releasing a series of free-to-play scenarios for Humankind as part of Amplitude's Open Dev initiative. And I am not familiar with Open Dev, but from kind of glossing over the articles, it looks like it's kind of a mixture of early access as well as an open beta, so that the developers are kind of collecting information about the scenarios that players are playing through in Open Dev, so that they can kind of continue working and fine-tuning the game for final release in 2021. And if you are interested in Amplitude's Open Dev and you want to sign up for it and get access to those scenarios, you can go to their website, Amplitude's website, and that link is, here it is, www.gamestogether.com, and it is not TWO or TO together. It is the number 2. So www.games number 2 GETHER.com. And then from there you can go and search for Humankind, search for Amplitude, and they've got the scenarios available there. And the scenarios that they've got so far, they include ones focused on Babylon, on Egypt, on Persia, on medieval France, on Korea. So kind of, I would say kind of greatest hits for 4X scenarios, particularly Egypt and Persia, and to a limited extent, I think Korea as well. That's become much more popular in the past couple of decades. But so, yeah, I'm curious to see those. There's been a lot of more preview coverage related to Humankind. A lot of journalists have gotten a hold of it and played several hours, and I think the main main point that they all have been pushing in those preview articles is the fact that Amplitude is really trying to change what many people consider to be the biggest problem with civilization, is the victory condition, right? Finding a way to get away from the kind of static victory conditions that we've had in civilization for the past almost 30 years now. John, I don't know if have you read any of that coverage? I don't know what you make of the kind of pre-release coverage for Humankind so far.
Yeah, I think it's got a lot of goodwill out there, there seems to be no reason not to give it some goodwill. I think Amplitude have done amazing things. They're one of these few studios where I would, them and Devolver are the two people that, like, I would probably buy almost everything they bring out, or at least look at it. So I'm definitely intrigued. I think that's been the goal. Again, going back to the Open Universalis, CK games, so on, Paradox games, the challenge of those games is learning how to enjoy playing like 10 hours of your actual life and 100 years of this in-game country where you're never the star.
Mm-hmm.
You're the Cincinnati Bengals, of medieval Europe, and that's just the way it's going to be, that's my closest NFL team. So fans, don't be upset at me. And how can you bring it into Civ? Because, they bring in religion and culture type things, and it's been very, very hard because there's going to be this, gamers are going to, you have this almost subconscious, or I'm here to play a game, how do I win the game type hardwiring stuff. So how do they get around that? Because it's not as simple as making religion a game you can win either, because how do you win religion? You make everybody Buddhist or whatever. So I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
I think they're getting a lot of positive coverage, but I think that's the right way to cover games until you know otherwise. So I'm excited. I'm disappointed by the delay, but even without present circumstances and everything, if that's what it takes to make the game better, then do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm curious to see what they do with kind of the end game for their 4X title. I think they've made a lot of reference to this so-called fame system, which sounds a little bit like a cultural victory. And I think that sounds more palatable, probably to most players, than the kind of extermination path available in Civilization. But at the same time, I think it's curious that, culture and fame is seen as a more palatable victory condition, largely because, that the past 40 so years since the end of the Cold War, cultural imperialism, cultural globalization has been a huge sticking point for most of the developing world. And I don't know if that's necessarily a more palatable version. I mean, it's certainly less violent, but it does do a lot of disservice to non-Western countries, non-Western states. So I'll be really curious to see how they deal with that. I'm going to take off my cultural Marxism hat now. And we're going to wrap things up with the new game announcements by talking about a couple of titles that came out or were announced during Sony's reveal related to the PlayStation 5. And John, you had a game, I think it's called Little Devil Inside, that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, I just thought this was an interesting kind of incident. So there's this, the PlayStation 5 reveal video was kind of, it was pretty good, and I'd encourage people to go and watch it if you haven't, even if you're just zooming through a lot of the kind of talking head stuff. A lot of good trailer stuff in there. And there was a trailer for this game, Little Devil Inside, which looks extraordinarily. The artwork is beautiful, and it just seems like a very promising, very imaginative game. And you very, very briefly in this trailer, you see these kind of mobs, I guess they are, these kind of clearly disposable bad guys running at you, and they're small, and they have these Polygon did a good a number of listed good stories on this that showed images, kind of white masks and hairstyle that may or may not be dreadlocks. On the white mask, these large red lips and everything, and it was just imagery that made a lot of people, or certainly made some people, feel very uncomfortable. And I myself, kind of watching the video, didn't really notice, in part because it just kind of goes by so quickly. When you see it, it's like, yeah, this is kind of very reminiscent of the kind of the gollywog type imagery that was very, very popular in the Western world at the beginning of the 20th century. If you don't know what that is, when I was a child, my favorite ice cream was a golly bar. And on the golly bar was a block of vanilla on a stick. I grew up in a poor country, and the golly. Oh well, not that poor because we had ice cream.
You had ice cream. Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and the golly was a small African dark skinned child with kind of dreadlocks or very, very curly hair and big red lips, and it's just all this. This was the 1980s. There's all this imagery that was very, very common decades earlier. So what interested me was the developers immediately came out and said, "Okay, we didn't, that was not intentional. We're going to review it." And then they very, very quickly came out after and said, "We're just going to redesign it. We're just going to redesign it." And I thought it was really interesting because, for one, they clearly have a very talented art team who are clearly enjoying the design part of their job. And so I think they could just make more things. I mean, obviously it's work, but I think that they'll enjoy it. But also, and my reaction to it was, it really seemed like a genuine apology. I really don't think they had any idea, and when it was brought to their attention, it's like, oh, and we don't even want to debate it. It's just a case of like, well, if it has that connotation, or if some people say it does, let's just get rid of it and do something else.
Yeah,
I thought it was just fascinating because for you and me as historians, this is how these things do persist, where people operating with the best of intentions who genuinely meant nothing by it. As far as I know, I doubt very much there's a closet wannabe KKK member on their team.
Yeah.
I'm very, very doubtful that would be the case. But this is how these things persist. I really thought it was fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of speaks to the importance of having a very diverse production team, diverse developers, and if you can have a diverse development team, perhaps have outside consultants help with that kind of stuff before you promote it, before you release trailers and whatnot. Because, you can, again, like you said, approach it with the best intentions, but then kind of be totally blind to a certain aspect of it. So, hopefully they can come up with something that's as compelling, or is not as insulting, I should say.
And I think I'm sorry. What I found interesting about it as well was that and it's just a trailer, but it was a really, really impressive trailer. And so it's just intriguing to me the extent to which what appears to be very good execution is helping to kind of shape the whole interaction. I think there's a couple of things. One, that was an isolated thing. It wasn't like there wasn't a recurring theme of weirdness. Like the most famous example of this in the last 10 years would be Resident Evil 5, right?
Yes.
Where they released this trailer that's just white Resident Evil guy murdering lots of, oh God, it was terrible. So that was awful. This didn't have that. And then it was just, it seems to be such a well-made game that when the developers are very quickly coming out going, oh God, didn't mean it, we'll change it. It's interesting to me that it didn't rumble on, as some kind of and they didn't ask to be absolved either. They didn't, they just kind of went, oh, okay. And I thought that was kind of intriguing. So if the game was less impressive looking, you know what I mean? Like if it was like a middling game or if those themes had continued. So all these little kind of, it's just fascinating because where should these tipping points be?
Yeah.
Because this wasn't a case of some people with some historians like you and me pointing it out after it came out. This happened almost immediately, at the time.
Yeah.
And like you say, Bob, having somebody from a group that might be considered to be represented by that kind of going, like someone in the room to kind of go, guys, that's a valuable input sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Another game that was mentioned in the Sony video stream was a game called Paradise Lost. I don't know if you saw any of this one, John, but it's a game that's scheduled to be released later this year. And in the game, which kind of looks, based on gameplay trailers, looks like kind of a walking simulator / puzzle solver. It has you playing as a 12-year-old boy who's caught up in a world in which the Second World War never ended. And in the world, you discover a mysterious Nazi bunker while roaming a kind of a post-apocalyptic version of Poland. And in this version of Poland, there's been the Second World War going on for 20 plus years. They've unleashed nuclear weapons, and so you are taking refuge in this Nazi bunker in this post-apocalyptic version of Poland. And so it's kind of a game, it looks like, has maybe similar alternative history elements to, say, like Wolfenstein, but it's not kind of a grab bag of action blockbuster cliches. Instead, it's kind of meditative, focused on quiet moments, walking simulator type game. And in the gameplay trailer I've seen so far, the so-called Nazi bunker this boy is going into has a lot of interesting elements. There's some serious Nordic elements to it as well. So I don't know. I'm curious about this one. It looks like kind of a alternative history game, but with a lot of extra mystery laid into it.
Yeah, and I saw a little bit. It looks interesting. All this kind of stuff makes you think of being an English major in college and how they would tell us. And of course, in the 1870s, all the novels were like, or some, Gothic, for example, such and such genre. This is what they're talking about. This is why they're talking about it. This is why the style was here. And we could start doing it now, but we'll be doing that in 40 years. Like, well, this was, derisively called walking simulator. So you have kind of the walking simulator thing. You have this continued commitment from lots of creators to really kind of play with narrative and gameplay. And then, Nazis, like you could, who's going to write, one of us should write a book on the evolution of depiction of Nazis in video games, because absolutely fascinating. And of course, they'll also look back and they'll explain to the young people 40 years from now that some idiots in Charlottesville, Virginia decided to be a clever idea to run around with tiki torches. And so it's one of these rare, the clouds clear and I'm like, oh, this is so weird. Like things like this are totally going to be discussed 40 years in the future. Yep. And of course, I hope Paradise Lost is a good enough video game to earn that kind of thing. But I'm not saying it sounds original. I'm just saying I can see it fitting into this zeitgeist going back at least a decade.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Definitely. So I think that does it for the history-related news that came out of quote-unquote non-E3. There were some interesting non-history-related games, and particularly for me, I was excited to hear that there was a new Horizon Zero Dawn game coming out called Horizon Forbidden West. There's a new Spider-Man game coming out. I don't know if anything caught your eye, John, anything that excited you from the past month of game news?
Definitely the Horizon Zero Dawn sequel, the kind of slow-burning mega hit. I mean, it sold really quickly. I feel like everyone realized after a month, oh, wait a minute, this game's amazing. They have dinosaurs, right? Robot dinosaurs. That's one of these games that puts so much effort into constructing its own history. I think we should be allowed to count it. Yeah. The Demon Soul remake.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I never finished Demon Soul, so that's totally something that I think I would play. But yeah, it's kind of I know everything feels in such a weird moment right now with all these things, with all these things. But I think overall it made me feel good. Stray, if anybody saw it, again on the PS5 reveal, where it's this really well rendered, beautiful kind of video or game engine stuff of a cat roaming, basically Tokyo populated by robots.
Yes. Yeah.
And it seems that you control the cat, so I hope that's something I want to play. It might be something I might want to read about somebody else playing, but yeah, things are healthy, and I think what interested me as well is the whole exclusive thing, especially for listeners our age and older. Bob, we'll remember when exclusives were a thing, like Peter Moore, who now works at Liverpool Football Club, revealing his Grand Theft Auto tattoo. and remembers that little cultural moment. And now that just feels like another planet entirely now.
Yeah.
Except maybe for Halo, I guess, and I guess God of War, but you know. So yeah, no, we're in good shape. Iron Harvest, there was a demo last week.
I know I missed it.
Uh,
Yeah. Did
I
you
missed it
get a
too
chance
because I
with?
have
No. Okay.
children.
Yeah.
I downloaded it. Don't know.
Can you still access it?
No,
No.
no, no.
No.
Sadly for me.
Yeah, I was really sad. It
looks good.
bad timing for me. I meant to go and for this podcast look at some of the maybe some of the words that people had written about playing it, or maybe even videos of them playing it, but I didn't have a chance to. But that's definitely a game that's on our radar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another non-history game I was excited by was Star Wars Squadrons, which came out during the EA press conference, video stream, whatever you want to call it. And this is a kind of, it looks like it's taking up the mantle of the old Star Wars Rogue Squadron games published by LucasArts, and updating that for the kind of modern multiplayer generation. So that game looked really awesome, and I'm really excited to try it out. It looks like it's also going to be published on VR platforms as well. So I might be in the market for a virtual reality headset. For our listeners, I've been texting and emailing John basically for the past 5 months, however long we've been in isolation, saying like, this might be the week I get the VR headset, and over again. I just talk myself out of it. But yeah, I might have to get a VR headset for that game. I'm really excited about it.
Cool.
All right. Well, I thought we might spend the last, I don't know, few minutes or so talking about some of the games that we've been playing. Either history games or non-history games. So I'm going to turn over to you, John. Ask you, what have you been playing? What have you been up to?
There's a game I've been playing that we've both been playing, so we'll talk about it in a minute. But I've also been playing the last few days Out of the Park Baseball 21.
Oh, okay.
Which is on sale. And for people who don't know, Out of the Park Baseball is a baseball management sim. It's probably the Crusader Kings. No, it's not. It's the Europa Universalis 3, I think, of not 4, of sports sims, in that it's awesome, but my God, you're kind of manipulating spreadsheets at a certain point. Actually, the whole point, it's ludicrously in depth. But the reason I bring it up is that I installed it and I'm really getting a lot of enjoyment out of it. And it's really, the last time I played it, they didn't have MLB license just yet, so you would have to randomize the names of the teams 3 times, then they would all magically match the current major league setup, which I loved. But now they have that, but they also have they have a huge amount of fan service towards historical players. So I'm playing Perfect Game, which is a version of kind of the FIFA Ultimate Team. Those EA card collecting, build your own team modes. Mm-hmm. They have that, and it's a lot of fun. And they have historical cards that you can buy through auction. Or you can pull out of a pack. You can buy an historical pack during certain sales periods and everything else. So I put in a bid last night for Satchel Paige, which is pretty cool. But it's not Satchel Paige in Negro Leagues. It's Satchel Paige in the Major League. So it's his rookie card.
Oh, no.
It's like already 42.
Yeah.
But he's pretty good because that's how it was in real life. And it's just really nice because they have like a, but they also have a Satchel Paige peak card, and they've got, all these different things. And so I think they've done a great job of matching together a more recent concept, which is fantasy baseball, the roto-wire type stuff from the 1980s going up till today, and video games, with card collecting, which goes back, a century at least. And it's really cool because you can get all these cards, and they're kind of trash for using in the actual game. You open a pack and one of them is usable, right? But then they have all these missions. Oh, well, if you want all the Detroit Tigers cards of the current roster, this guy counts towards that collection. And you open up that little page, and it's like a little virtual card collection. And in fact, I mentioned Satchel Paige, they have a special Negro Leagues collection, because this year is the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues. There's a huge move from baseball historians online to celebrate that fact and celebrate this amazing kind of part of baseball's history. So it's really well done. And of course, if you go away from the build your own team perfect team mode, in the regular mode, you can pick any season you want in the history of baseball as your starting season.
Wow.
So if you want to see if you could win with the 1927 Yankees, which theoretically shouldn't be very hard, you can do that. And I just think it's just amazing. Like one of these days, I've got to figure out a way, some fun thing to do. Maybe I would just simulate a season and blog about it on the website or something. Because it's a very slow burn
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing, but it definitely appeals to a specific type of historian.
Yeah.
And of course, baseball is obsessed with its history. And I think this is one of the best games I've ever seen that successfully translates that into video games.
Yeah, and many historians I know are obsessed with baseball, largely because it has such a rich history. And I think it's awesome to hear that they've got so many historical elements in the game. So you can't have the team names, right? But they've got players in there. How does that work?
They can now.
Okay.
Yeah. A couple
Okay.
of years ago they couldn't have any of it, but now they
Okay.
have the full license. They have all of it. They have on the Steam page they have a certain man, Mr. Henry, owner of Liverpool Football Club, and to a lesser extent the Boston Red Sox. It's this other team he also owns. Sorry, I'm just being ridiculous. Um, and he's gushing about how good they are and everything, and it's a ludicrously intimidating game. If anybody's listening to it going, that sounds kind of interesting, know that it's desperately intimidating. So if you open up a regular game, it's like, hey, do you want to hire managers for your major league team, your AAA, your AA, your single A in Mexico, and your single A in Hawaii? And it's like it's just it's pretty deep.
Yeah.
But you could play the perfect game mode and do what I'm doing, which is just looking for cards of players you thought were cool,
Yeah.
and putting them on second base. And Satchel Paige, hopefully, I'll check after we're finished recording. He should start my next game for me, hopefully, if I
Nice.
won the auction. So
Nice.
yeah,
That's fun. So you'd mentioned it up at the top of this section, but we've both been playing The Last of Us 2. And this is a game, I guess it must have come out a couple weeks ago, I want to say. So
I think so.
we'll avoid spoilers here, which I think will be pretty easy. But what have you made of that game so far?
I really like it so far. I have friends who finished it already. I have children, and I basically squeeze in a little bit of gameplay. I'm playing this game in the weirdest way, like 30 minutes at a time
Yeah.
each night. So I'm very sort of moving through it. It's funny because both this and the previous game can get mixed reviews sometimes online. But I loved the first game. I thought the first game kind of did narrative in a kind of a AAA big budget game in a way that was really impressive. I think that the story is just good. I think that video game people will often give games a pass on their story. Will even celebrate stories that, in truth, maybe aren't that impressive. And I think a lot of the time that's fine and it's justified. But I thought the story of the first game was excellent. I won't even spoil the first game. And I think a similar thing is happening in the second in this new game. I think the story so far is really good. The characters are really well realized, and then they match that with this enormous investment of labor and money into creating these. The word used to be photorealistic, right? Like these amazing, these ways that the human actors on whom the characters are visually based, are expressing astonishing nuance, in their faces. That's the least academic way to say that. But so
Tremendous
for me,
facial fidelity.
yeah, I guess so. But then it sounds like kind of a manual thing. But I think back, to a game of which I know you're very fond, Bob, L.A. Noir.
Yeah.
And the plaudits that it rightfully got for like really kind of going hard on how characters' faces could become evocative, and we're just seeing, I think Naughty Dog they're kind of looping in all these big budget game lessons into a storytelling driven game.
Yeah.
Is how I feel about it.
Yeah.
So I'm really enjoying it so far.
Yeah. I'm really enjoying it too. I think a lot of criticism that's been written about it, and I've been avoiding it largely because I don't want to spoil the game for myself, but it seems like in the bits of criticism that I've read, a lot of it centers on kind of the game's violence and graphic depiction of violence, and kind of making the point that this is more of The Last of Us, because The Last of Us had a lot of those same elements. And for me, I adored the first game, and so hearing that this game was more of The Last of Us, that's just right up my alley. And like you, I've been playing it about an hour of night. I'm about 16 hours in. And I think at this point, though, I'm kind of ready to see the end, but I hear that there's a lot more of the game ahead of me, so I'm a little bit intimidated by that, but I'm also kind of the opinion that I'm okay with the length of the game because it gives me these, like you've talked about, it gives me these kind of nightly episodes of the game, basically, where I can play for half an hour to an hour and feel fulfilled, and then do the same thing again tomorrow night. I think if I was still in my 20s without kids, I definitely would have finished it by now. I probably would have finished it in one weekend. But it's been nice to have it kind of stretched out over the course of a few weeks, not only because it gives me something to do at night, but then also I think it helps to mediate a little bit of the kind of problem with violence and brutality that the game has, and makes it a little bit easier to take because I'm not doing it all at once. I think that if you were playing it like somebody who was reviewing the game, in the span of 3 days or so, it might be a lot to take in all at once.
That's a great point, because I mean, the way that I'm playing it, I tend to kind of I'll say to my wife, so listen, I'm just going to get to the next story beat, and then we'll watch the next episode of Succession together. That's basically what's been happening. And which is an HBO show with Brian Cox in it. And I'm always banging this drum, but I'm fascinated. I think it's a great thing for the medium overall. The medium has found so many different ways to talk about and represent violence, and other things as well. Horror games, of course, are a genre with a long history. But it's also intriguing to me that, I know people get awkward about the video games as art discussions and everything else, but literature has a lot of different ways it handles these kinds of things. And one of the ways that novels handle violence is to make you feel bad. There are novels that explicitly do that, deliberately. They're trying to do that. And it's just, I think that's just interesting that video games are starting to move into that kind of territory. And it's okay that not everyone liked that, or people felt it wasn't successful in that way. But I also think, and I've been thinking of this a lot with some of the revelations over the last week or two in video games culture more broadly, that I often think of, Bob, of you and me as this first generation that have kind of grown up with games, which isn't actually true at all. The generation ahead of us kind of is. But I think back to representations of violence didn't bother me at all when I was 15, that by the time I was 30, I was like, oh my God. Representations of women, for example, or any kinds of sexual things, or stuff that didn't bother me at all when I was 21. When 10 years later, I've got, I'm married to a woman and she's in the house and I don't want her to see this game I'm playing.
Yeah.
I forget what game that was. And it wasn't, it wasn't Dead or Alive or anything like that. But, so it's just intriguing to me that I don't know how we handle that at the same time, because, what we're starting to see, I think the writing online is going to be dominated by people in their 20s for a lot of different reasons. There's nothing wrong with being in your 20s, don't get me wrong. But we're definitely starting to see different age groups writing on stuff simultaneously. And I'm just kind of intrigued by that.
Yeah.
Because now we're getting all these different kinds of takes. Because, I mean, let me be clear. I am not arguing that John Harney writing at, age 39 has more authenticity or more I don't know what I'm looking for. My views are not more legitimate than a 19-year-old. That's not what I'm saying. But I think we see more of that kind of generational diversity now than was possible 20 years ago.
Yeah. And one of the things I would say to that is that I think it's great to have so many different age groups writing, and so many different people from diverse backgrounds writing about games, because there's this sense, and that I would say, particularly with game critics and people who just play games, who are in their late 30s, their 40s, who've grown up with games, who kind of feel like they have ownership over it. And you hear this refrain a lot. It's like when they're talking about games, criticizing games, and it's like, well, that's just video games. That's just the way the medium is. When it comes to sexism, when it comes to ultra violence, it's just the way it is. That's just the medium. But you're getting more diverse writers. You're getting writers from different age groups who are coming in and saying, why is that the case, right? Why are we doing it this way? And that's great. I think that totally needs to happen. And that's really refreshing. So I think, to speak to your point, I too feel like I don't have a better claim over the truth of games than somebody who's just coming to them and just starting to write about them, or just starting to write games. I think that the great thing about video games is that the medium is still pretty loose. I don't think it's gotten into the state that film and certainly novels have gotten into, where they feel very kind of siloed, right? You've got your science fiction here, you got your nonfiction stories, all of this stuff. I don't feel like games have really gotten to that point, unless you're talking about like racing games or fighting games.
Sure.
Anything that's got a narrative base to it still feels very open, and I think it's really exciting, and I'm really excited about the next decade. So long as the virus doesn't kill us all, I'm really excited to see the new games that come out, and coming from different perspectives.
Yeah, and I think you're making a great point, because the dominant perspective theoretically was effectively the perspective of a 16-year-old boy / man, even though it was being executed by 35-year-old men. And I say that not necessarily in super specific gender racial ways, but just like esports is such a great example of this. Like when StarCraft 2 was the only esport, StarCraft 1 was the only esport, and there were guys like top players in StarCraft who, when they lost a game, would go onto the chat with them and the other player and just fire obscenities at them.
Oh yeah.
Like called them most awful.
Oh, yeah.
It was just shocking, unacceptable, not adult behavior, and nobody. The only reaction ever was, "Oh, that guy, he's famous for that." And like nobody stepped in. Whereas now, if you were watching League of Legends Worlds and someone did that, like that would be a scandal. It'd be unacceptable. And so it's an example of one of the positives, I think, that comes from, mainstreaming. Because you can't have it both ways, right? You can't have these games that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make with massive teams, but also have it respond to the exact things you liked 20 years ago. It's just not how it works.
Yeah. All right, well, that does it for me. I haven't played anything else. What about you? Anything?
Monster Train. People should play Monster Train. It's really good. So Monster Train it's basically a deck building card game that that I shouldn't be playing because it's eaten up my life. That's so.
What's with you and cards? You've got cards in your baseball game. You've got cards in your Monster Train.
It's true. It's true. I'm on a card playing binge. It's true.
Well, I think that does it for this episode of History Respawn. John, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. Thank you, Bob. It's always fun. And dear listener, thank you for tuning in and listening to this episode of the History Respawn podcast. If you're interested in learning more about History Respawn, please visit our website at www.historyrespawn.com. And if you enjoy our work, enjoy the show, then please consider supporting us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/History Respawn. Until next time, goodbye.